Hello friends and explorers chasing that frothy miracle that bound humanity to settled life. Today, we'll focus on the history of beer, a journey that began by chance 13,000 years ago in Nachafian caves and became sacred in Sumerian temples. From the mystery of that first fermentation where barley met water to become liquid, bread to the daily rations of the pyramid builders and Bavaria's purity laws, we'll see how beer has shaped society. If you drink beer, what's your favorite type? I always enjoy reading your comments. You trudge through the muddy lanes of Euro around 400 BCE, and the first thing you notice, besides the goat casually eating trash, is the strange smell of fermentation wafting from clay jars. Here barley is life ground into bread, boiled into porridge, or most importantly, soaked, soured, and transformed into beer. The Sumerians didn't write novels or shopping lists, but they sure did write hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. Imagine a deity whose whole job is making sure you get a decent pint after a long day of brick laying on a ziggurat. Historians still argue whether the famous himasi is a recipe, a prayer, or maybe both. But it reads like the world's earliest brew manual set to music, the beer itself. Forget crisp golden lagers. You're drinking a thick porridge-like slurry with bits of grain floating in it. You don't even bother lifting the pot. Instead, you and your friends lean in with long reed straws, slurping together like kids at a milkshake bar. Except this milkshake has yeast floating in it. And instead of a cherry on top, there's the possibility of mild food poisoning. Still, compared to the alternative, raw river water teeming with parasites, beer feels like liquid salvation. There's a quirky tidbit you might like. Some scholars believe people literally baked loaves of partially cooked bread, then crumbled them into water to ferment. Sort of like making soup, except the soup gets you tipsy. Other theories claim beer might have come before bread, that humans stumbled into fermentation while trying to store damp grain. Picture it. Someone forgets a jar of soggy barley, opens it a few days later, takes a brave sip, and boom, civilization changes forever. In the bustling market, you see clay tablets scratched with cuneiform. Their receipts, contracts, ration records, and many of them involve beer. Workers weren't just paid in silver or food, but in daily rations of brew. Beer wasn't just a drink. It was currency, nutrition, and ritual all rolled into one. You'd have downed several liters a day, but don't worry, it's weak stuff. Maybe 2 to 3% alcohol. More like liquid bread than modern IPAs that brag about their skull-crushing hops. Speaking of hops, none of that here yet. Sumerian beer spoils quickly. Brew today, drink tomorrow, or you'll have sour sludge. Historians still argue whether these people truly brewed in the modern sense, or just let nature handle it, tossing wet grain into a pot and hoping yeast gods were in a good mood. What we do know is that this murky, drink-fueled armies, temple builders, and farmers alike. Imagine yourself sitting at a low clay bench. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the ziggurat towers in gold. Someone places a jar of beer in front of you. It's communal. You share with neighbors, strangers, and priests alike. The liquid tastes sour, nutty, and faintly sweet, and as it slides down, you feel the gentle calm that must have carried countless Sumerians through their endless toil. Somewhere in the distance, musicians pluck lyres and a priestess raises her cup to Ninasi. And here's the funny part. In some of those tablets, there are mentions of taverns. Yes, the world's earliest bars. Picture an ancient dive where patrons stumble in after work, swapping gossip, slapping clay tokens down for another jar. The bartender, possibly a woman, since many early tavern keepers were female. Running establishments, the historians still debate whether they doubled as brothel, social clubs, or both. Either way, you realize humanity hasn't changed much. On a long day, grab a drink. You lean back, belly warm, headlight. Around you, civilization hums along. Scribes etching contracts, priests chanting prayers, soldiers sharpening bronze blades, and underpinning it all is the low, steady thrum of fermentation, the first pint in history. And you're right, they're sipping it, froth and all. You wake up the next morning, still in Mesopotamia. But let's be honest, your head feels like you've swallowed a clay tablet. No worries, because your journey drifts down the Nile, where the Egyptians have taken beer and turned it into something both sacred and everyday. The air is heavy with humidity, reeds swaying by the riverbanks, and barges glide past carrying cargo, fish, and of course, grain destined for brewing. Here, beer isn't just a drink. It's woven into the very structure of society. Workers hauling limestone blocks for the pyramids, paid partly in bread and beer rations. In fact, some historians argue the pyramids were essentially built on barley wages. Imagine a construction site today where instead of lunch breaks with sandwiches and soda, you clock out for a jar of frothy, slightly sour beer. OSHA might faint, but in ancient Egypt it was perfectly normal. The beer itself looks cloudy, smells tangy, and is often described as liquid bread. It's brewed from immer, wheat, and barley, sometimes sweetened with dates or honey. Not exactly a Heineken, but after baking bricks in the Egyptian sun all day, you'd hardly complain. And hey, nutritionally, it's loaded. This beer has calories, B vitamins, and enough bulk to count as both meal and medicine. One quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found beer residue in massive ceramic vats in what were essentially ancient industrial breweries. Some sites suggest output in the thousands of liters per batch. You can almost hear the slush of fermentation as workers paddle grain mash with wooden sticks, the air buzzing with fruit flies. And let's not forget the goddess Eta, often tied to drunken joy and beer itself. There's even a wild myth about her nearly destroying humanity, only to be calmed when the gods tricked her with vats of red dyed beer that she mistook for blood. She drank so much, she passed out, and humankind was spared. Talk about the ultimate beer saves lives story. But here's where it gets even funnier. Beer wasn't just for the living. Tomb paintings and hieroglyphs show scenes of brewing, offering jars, and eternal feasts stocked with beer for the afterlife. Pharaohs, priests, even humble workers were often buried with vessels meant to carry them through eternity with a decent pint. Historians still argue whether those jars contained actual beer or symbolic offerings. But either way, death without a drink was apparently unthinkable. You wander into a marketplace. The smell of grilled fish mingles with the yeastiness of fresh beer. Women sit behind stalls, serving cups from clay jars sealed with reed plugs. Children sip watered-down versions because, yes, beer is safer than the Nile, which is crawling with parasites, hippos, and the occasional floating crocodile. You wonder briefly whether crocodile dung sunscreen rumored in some records might have been slathered on the brewer's arms as she ladles your portion. Practical or gross? Historians still argue. As you sip, you notice how socially fluid beer is here. The pharaoh might enjoy honey-sweetened alash from golden cups, while farmers gulp the same base brew from rough clay mugs. Beer bridges, class lines, making it one of the rare communal experiences of the ancient world. That said, it also became a taxable commodity, carefully tracked by scribes. In fact, some surviving astrachia, scraps of pottery used for writing, are basically bar tabs. Humanity has always known the pain of running up a tab, it seems. You stroll along the Nile's edge, watching brewery workers tip steaming mash into fermentation jars. The air fills with the scent of malt, a sharp yeasty tenth that sticks in your throat. In the background, chants rise from a temple to Osiris, god of agriculture and renewal, who is linked, unsurprisingly, to Be as well. Priests pour foaming jars as offerings, their voices droning like the hum of and just when you think it's all sunshine and barley, you overhear something odd. Some Egyptian doctors prescribed beer mixed with strange ingredients, frankincense, herbs, even crocodile dung, again for medical treatments. Scholars debate whether this was actual medicine or just placebo with a buzz, but it shows how deeply beer seeped into every layer of life here. As the sun dips, painting the river bronze, you cradle your jar. Around you, children chase goats, merchants bicker, and the eternal flow of the Nile keeps everything alive. Beers become not just nourishment, but a cultural anchor, a bridge between gods and men, life and afterlife. You take another sip, sour, sweet, earthy, and realize in Egypt, beer isn't just something you drink. It's something you live by and even die with. You drift north and east from an isle, stepping into the bustling avenues of Babylon. The city rises before you, walls thick enough to host chariot races, ziggurats looming like staircases to the heavens, and canals that snake through markets full of spices, livestock, and most importantly, beer. The scent of malt hovers everywhere, warm, bready, slightly sour. Because in Babylon, beer isn't just refreshment, it's regulated, codified, and written into the very laws of the land. You brush your fingers across a tall basalt stele carved with tiny wedge-shaped cuneiform, the Code of Hammurabi. This isn't just a dusty relic. It's one of the earliest known law codes in history. And believe it or not, beer gets special mention. Some laws lay out strict penalties for tavern keepers who water down beer or cheat customers. One passage even threatens execution if a barkeep is caught shortchanging patrons. Imagine your local dive bar having the death penalty for weak pours. Suddenly, those flat draft nights don't seem so bad. Historians still argue whether these laws were enforced literally or more as symbolic threats. But either way, you wouldn't dare send back a pint in Babylon. Here, taverns pulse with life. Many are run by women, and some records suggest they doubled as hubs of information, gossip, and sometimes questionable side hustles. You duck inside one dimly lit, low clay benches. Chatter in Adian filling the air. A woman serves you a jar, froth spilling over the rim. The beer is thicker than Egyptian brews, almost like a grain smoothie flavored, sometimes with dates to sweeten the temps. It slides down rough and hearty, and you feel a pleasant heaviness spread through your limbs. One quirky tidbit: beer here was often used in rituals of divination. Priests would pour it and watch the bubbles foam and even how the liquid moved, trying to read omens from the patterns. Picture a priest peering into his mug and declaring, "Ah, yes, the barley says your goat will definitely run away tomorrow." Historians still argue whether this was taken seriously or more like a ritualized superstition, but it shows how central beer was to the culture. Outside, canals glimmer under torchlight. You pass workers hauling clay tablets to scribes who record grain shipments and, of course, beer rations. Much like in Sumer and Egypt, workers here are often paid partly in beer, a system that keeps labor flowing and loyalty intact. Even soldiers marching under the banner of Babylon expect their daily outment, fuel for war and worship alike. But beer isn't only for the masses. The wealthy and elite sometimes enjoy refined versions, strained, sweetened, and stored in fancier jars. At banquets, musicians play lyres and harps, while noble guests sip beers of varying strengths. Archaeologists have even found references to strong beer versus weak beer, suggesting a whole menu of options. You can almost imagine a Babylonian beer list scrolled on clay. Today's specials: date ale, honey brew, and the thick stuff that'll knock you flat. As you wander deeper into the city, you stumble into the Ishtar Gate, brightly glazed tiles gleaming in blues and golds. Lions and dragons striding proudly across the surface. Behind it, a festival is underway. People drink beer from tall jugs. Music throbs and laughter rises in waves. The air is alive with humanity, intoxication and ritual. Beer here is more than liquid. It's glue for the social order, binding law, labor, faith, and fun together. And yet, like all things, it carries a warning. The Code of Hammurabi makes tavern owners responsible for more than drinks. They're accused of harboring criminals if they don't report suspicious customers. You sip slowly, realizing taverns double as surveillance systems, a far cry from the laid-back pubs of today. Here, every cup is tracked, every sip woven into the grand machinery of empire. By the time the moon hangs high above Babylon, your belly is full, your head buzzing, and your clay cup is empty. Around you, strangers laugh, priests mutter chants, and soldiers bellow drinking songs. You glance back at Hammurabi's laws carved in cold stone and think, in Babylon, beer isn't just life, it's law. You shuffle westward, sandals scuffing dusty roads, until olive trees begin to the hillsides. The scent of resin grapes and goat herds fills the air. You've stepped into the land of the Greeks. Here, wine is king, flowing in symposiums poured for gods and toasted by philosophers who never met a cup they didn't overthink. And yet, lingering on the fringes, like an awkward cousin at a family reunion, stands beer. The Greeks call it zithos, or kikin, depending on region and recipe. But don't expect Homer to sing many praises of barley brew to the sophisticated Athenian elite. Beer feels a little too rustic, too barbarian. The sort of thing Egyptians or other non-Greek peoples guzzle. Imagine showing up at a chic wine tasting with a six-pack of light lager. You get sided into oblivion. Historians still argue whether Greek disdain for beer was genuine or exaggerated later, but surviving writings hint at their skepticism. And yet, beer wasn't absent. Archaeological digs in northern Greece have uncovered brewing equipment and the less wine-friendly regions. Think grain fields, not vineyards, did dabble in making their own barley drinks. The common folk, soldiers on campaign, and rural farmers may have turned to beer when grapes weren't handy. You take a sip from a rough clay cup. The brew, tangy, earthy, and a little sour. And you can almost hear a philosopher whispering, yes, but does it pair with Plato? One quirky tidbit. The kikian, a barley-based drink, shows up in the Eleusinian mysteries. Secret religious rites tied to deer and fanony. Was it alcoholic beer? A psychoactive potion? Historians still argue. Some claim the mix might have included ergot, a fungus with LSD-like effects, meaning initiates could have been tripping while chanting prayers to the grain goddess. Suddenly, that sacred beverage feels a lot more experimental. Shift now to Rome, where things get complicated. Like the Greeks, Romans view beer as second tier to wine. The Latin word, cervesia, yes, like cervezia, today, exists. But beer is considered rustic, foreign, and tied to the northern tribes. Roman writers sometimes mock beer drinkers, treating it as proof of barbarian universalization. Tacitus once sneered about the Germans guzzling a fermented grain mash, shaking his patrician head as if nothing good could come from people who didn't worship Bacchus with proper grapes. But while the elite sip Fernian vintages, soldiers stationed on distant frontiers tell a different story. Imagine being posted in Britannia or Germania, far from vineyards, stuck in cold rain. Wine casks take forever to arrive, but local beer readily available. You, a Roman legionary, crouch beside a smoky fire, sipping the thick local ale, pretending you don't enjoy it more than the watered-down wine back home. Here's the twist. Beer spread anyway. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman beer brewing in outposts across Europe. Clay strainers, brewing vats, and residue suggest locals taught the legions, and soon beer became part of the garrison diet. In fact, a papyrus from Roman Egypt mentions Ziph shipments, proving beer had a foothold even within the empire's bureaucratic machinery. Historians still argue whether beer was tolerated grudgingly or secretly beloved by common Romans, but it definitely never disappeared. You walk through a bustling Roman tavern, Capona, where soldiers, travelers, and peasants crowd around wooden tables. Jugs of sour wine stand beside jars of beer. Patrons laugh, gamble, and slurp barley brew flavored with herbs, since hops are still centuries away. The taste, rough, funky, and different in every region. And here's your eyeball fact. Roman medical writers like Dioscorides and Plenty the Elder actually discuss beer's health uses. Some claim it helps digestion, others that it causes bloating. Plenty even notes that beer could be turned into a kind of foam used for soap. Yes, you're rubbing beer bubbles on your face. Historians still argue if that counts as hygiene or just ancient frat boy behavior. By now, you've traced beer through lands where it was beloved, dismissed, and debated. You finish your clay mug in a smoky tavern, the chatter of Latin echoing in your ears. Outside, the empire stretches endlessly, wine flowing at its heart, but beer quietly bubbling at its edges, waiting for its turn to shine. The candlelight flickers against stone walls, and the smell of malt drifts through vated corridors. You've arrived in medieval Europe, and specifically within a monastery. Outside, peasants trudge muddy paths. Markets bustle with turnipses and salted fish, and wolves sometimes prowl just beyond the village edge. Inside these cloisters, however, monks in brown robes move with deliberate calm, humming psalms as they tend cauldrons of bubbling grain mash. You've stepped into the world where beer becomes salvation in more ways than one. Monasteries are the breweries of the Middle Ages. From the 6th century onward, monastic orders, Benedictines, Cistercians, and others develop recipes, refine techniques, and elevate beer from rustic mash to crafted product. The rule of Saint Benedict even allowed monks their daily ration of drink, and since water was often dodgy, beer became the holy loophole. One medieval writer described beer as liquid bread, nourishing both body and spirit. And let's be honest, if you're fasting, a thick mug of malt ale makes fasting a lot more bearable. You taste seed on a rough bench. A monk ladles out ale from a wooden vat into your cup. The brew is dark, strong, with a roasted sweetness and a warming kick. This isn't a thin beer of Sumer or Babylon. It's heartier, richer, more like the beginnings of what you'd recognize in a modern pint. Monks track brewing with careful notes, experimenting with mold, drying, yeast handling, and eventually even hops. Their libraries hold not just scripture, but brewing logs. Quirky tidbit. Some monasteries actually mark their barrels with symbols of the Virgin Mary or local saints, essentially giving you holy beer. And some abbeys even brewed multiple strengths. Small beer for peasants and pilgrims, stronger stuff for the monks themselves, and the richest alish reserved for feast days or noble guests. Historians still argue whether medieval monks got tipsy in the name of God, or genuinely saw beer as a form of devotion. But either way, they brewed with precision and care. Outside the cloister, taverns hum with peasants who can't afford fine wine. For them, ale is breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You sip a weaker brew at a village tavern, thin, sour, and barely alcoholic. But it keeps disease at bay and fills empty stomachs. Remember, clean drinking water isn't a given. A is safer than a stream and cheaper than imported wine. Children drink it. Farmers gulp it in the fields, and housewives often brew it in small batches at home, their kitchens doubling as microbreweries. But here, inside monasteries, beer begins its long march toward sophistication. Monks experiment with flavorings. Herbs like bog, myrtle, rosemary, and yarrow are tossed into brews to balance the sweetness. Hops are still rare in this early period, but whispers of them are spreading from German lands. You notice a monk scribbling notes describing how certain herbs preserve beer longer, sparking debates that will later change brewing forever. Historians still argue whether hops were first embraced for taste or practicality, but we'll get to that revolution soon enough. The monastery is also a hub of charity. Pilgrims trudging along holy routes stop for bread and ale, sometimes offered freely. Imagine walking days in rain and mud, only to arrive at a warm abbey where monks serve you foaming mugs. No wonder monasteries gained reputations as safe havens. Some orders even build goose houses alongside their breweries, essentially inventing the medieval bed and breakfast, complete with a house pint. By torchlight, you hear chants rising from the chapel, mingling with the scent of malt and yeast from the brewery. The rhythm of life hears prayer, labor, brewing, repeat. In the wider medieval world, chaos reigns, feudal wars, famines, and plague. But inside these walls, brewing is steady, sacred work. Beer here isn't just a drink. It's nutrition, medicine, and faith in liquid form. And here's the oddball moment. Some monks were said to test the strength of beer by soaking a wooden bench with it, then sitting down in their robes. If they stuck to the bench, the beer was strong enough, sticky science at its finest. You chuckle, taking another sip, and realize this blend of solemn devotion and quirky tradition gave rise to some of the most enduring brewing legacies. As the night deepens, you cradle your cup. Beyond the monastery, stars scatter across the sky, and wolves howl faintly in the dark. But within these stone walls, beer is warmth, safety, and maybe even holiness poured into a mug. The monastery bells fade into memory as you stumble down muddy tracks, your feet splashing through puddles. The road smells of smoke, manure, and damp hay. You've entered the everyday world of medieval peasants. Gone are the solemn hymns and measured brewing logs of the monks. Here, beer is simple, rustic, and absolutely everywhere. In fact, If you're thirsty, you don't even ask for water. You ask for ale. You push open the crooked door of a timber tavern. Inside it's dim, smoky from the hearth with rough-hewn benches crammed with farmers, merchants, and the occasional wandering minstrel. The air hums with laughter, dice clattering across tables, and the sour-sweet temps of ale wafting from barrels. Someone hands you a wooden cup. The beer is pale, thin, and barely fizzy. But it's safe, filling, and after a day of hauling turnips is utterly refreshing. This isn't the carefully crafted abbey ale. It's the daily drink of survival. For peasants, beer is breakfast. No joke, children sip small beer, a very weak brew with barely any alcohol, while adults down stronger stuff in the fields or at meals. Imagine kids with mugs of cereal-flavored liquid bread. It sounds wild, but it beats parasites from the village. Well, historians still argue whether the average medieval villager drank 2 or 3 liters a day or more. But either way, your bladder would have been a full-time job. Quirky tidbit. Women dominated brewing at home. Known as aloofs, they made beer and kitchens, sodded from doorways, and sometimes marked their houses with broomsticks stuck above the door. Yes, you heard right. Some scholars suggest that image may even have fed into later witch stereotypes. Women with cauldrons, herbs, pointy hats, and broomsticks tied to brewing, not sorcery. Next time someone says witch, picture her just trying to sell you a pint. You lean against a wooden beam as the tavern fills with noise. Beer here isn't just hydration, it's community glue. Weddings, harvest feasts, and even funerals are toasted with ale. Villagers gather to hash out disputes, strike bargains, or just swap gossip over mugs. And unlike monasteries, where beer is brewed with careful devotion, here it's about quick turnaround. Brew today, drink tomorrow, repeat. No aging, no finesse. Just the constant rhythm of fermentation. Outside the tavern, you pass cottages where housewives stir steaming pots of malt, the children running barefoot through smoke. Grain shortages sometimes make brewing tricky and substitutions appear. Oats, rye, even beans get tossed in. The result, sometimes delicious, sometimes an undrinkable sludge. Historians still argue whether peasant beer was consistent or wildly variable. But judging from the look of your mug tonight, it's probably the latter. Taxes creep into the story, too. Lords and kings quickly realize that beer being universal makes a perfect revenue stream. Some taverns pay fees to operate. Some brews are taxed per batch. And ale tasters, yes, actual officials wander towns to make sure quality meets local standards. Imagine your city health inspector showing up not to check for rats, but to confirm your pint isn't watered down. The punishment for fraud, public humiliation, or worse. As the night deepens, minstrels strike up a tune, and the tavern sways with song. Farmers toast the harvest. Young men laugh over spilled ale, and old women shake their heads at the noise while secretly enjoying their cups. The ale tastes sour, faintly smoky, with a grainy chewiness that sticks to your teeth. Not glamorous, but comforting. A taste that belongs to every corner of life. One odd detail. Some medieval was said to serve beer and horn cups, which depending on how you held them, might spill if you weren't careful. Was a clumsy design or a clever way to keep patrons from hogging drinks? Historians still argue. Either way, you sip carefully, not eager to waste precious calories on the floor. By midnight, the tavern quiets. A few peasants doze on benches, mugs slipping from their hands. You step outside into crisp air, stars bright above the thatched rooftops. The faint smell of brewing clings to the village, drifting like wood smoke. Life here is hard. Famines, wars, and plagues are constant threats. But as you wipe foam from your lips, you realize beer is the steady companion, always there to soften hunger, bring people together, and make the struggle a little easier to bear. You leave the muddy village behind and follow the scent of something sharper, more bitter, carried on the wind from the north. The year is somewhere around the 9th or 10th century, and you're standing near a wooden brewhouse in Germany, watching as a brewer tosses something unusual into the boiling pot. Cones of green hops. Steam rises, carrying a floral rhinous aroma that makes you wrinkle your nose. This is the moment beer begins to change forever. Up until now, beer has been flavored and preserved with grit. A grey bag mix of herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, rosemary, or juniper. Every region had its own recipe, often controlled by church authorities or local lords. Brewers paid fees or taxes to use the official grit blend, and in return, they had something to mask beer sweetness and maybe keep it from spoiling too quickly. But grit had limits. Beer went bad fast, and quality was wildly inconsistent. Then hops show up. The earliest references go back centuries earlier. But in this period, their popularity explodes in Central and Northern Europe. Hops preserve beer much longer and add a distinctive bitter flavor that balances malt sweetness. Suddenly, beer can last weeks, even months, instead of just days. You take a sip from a wooden mug. The taste is sharper, less cloying, with a freshness that lingers on your tongue. Compared to the sour, sweet sludge of earlier times, it feels revolutionary. Quirky tidbit. Some monks were initially suspicious of hops, calling them a wicked and malevolent herb. Maybe it was the strong bitterness, or maybe because hops threatened to grip trade, which funneled money to bishops and princes. Historians still argue whether the resistance to hops was truly about taste or more about economics and power. Either way, once people realized hops' extended shelf life, there was no going back. Picture medieval merchants loading barrels of hop beer onto riverboats, sending them down the Rhine. Suddenly, beer can travel farther, fueling a growing trade network. Towns like Bremen and Hamburg become brewing powerhouses, shipping their hopped Alash across Europe. For the first time, beer isn't just local, it's exportable, a commodity with international reach. You stand in a bustling German market, barrels rolling over cobblestones, brewers shouting prices, tavern signs creaking in the wind. The air is alive with possibility. A merchant offers you 2 mugs, one brewed with grit, thick and herby, almost medicinal, the other brewed with hops, bright and bitter. You sip both, coughing a little at the herbal mix, but finding yourself strangely refreshed by the hoppy pint. The choice is clear. You'd follow the hopheads. Oddball fact: early hop beers were sometimes so strong they were nicknamed liquid bread. Monks, always clever with loopholes, argued that drinking hop beer during fasting didn't break religious rules, since it was technically food. Some abbeys even ramped up production during Lent, turning self-denial into a profitable brewing season. You picture a monk solemnly declaring, "I am absolutely fasting," while downing his 3rd mug of double-strength ale. The hop revolution doesn't just change taste, it changes culture. Brewing shifts from a small-scale household or monastic job into an increasingly regulated professional industry. Town councils begin writing rules about hops, grain quality, and brewing rights. Eventually, laws like the Reinheitbot, the German beer purity law of 1516 emerge, declaring that beer can only contain barley, water, and hops. Yeast wasn't understood yet. Historians still argue whether this was about protecting quality, preserving tax revenues, or simply kneecapping competitors. As the sun sets, you stand on a hilltop overlooking miles of hop fields. Tall poles stretch toward the sky, vines climbing, cones rustling in the breeze. Farmers tend the crops, knowing these bitter blossoms are worth their weight in gold. Below, towns buzz with taverns serving sharper, cleaner beer than any generation before them. You sip from a tankard, the bitterness lingering pleasantly, and realize hops have forever altered the flavor of history. The riverboats creak downstream, their barrels of hopperdale sloshing, and before long you find yourself standing in the heart of a bustling medieval town. The streets are narrow, lined with crooked timber houses, their upper stories leaning so close you could shake hands across the alley. The air smells of baking bread, manure, smoke, and unsurprisingly, beer. This is where brewing shifts from monastery walls and peasant cottages to the lifeblood of urban economies. You duck into a crowded square where guild banners flutter overhead. In many cities, brewing has become an organized profession, with guilds regulating who can brew, how much, and at what quality. Brewing is no longer just an alewife's kitchen chore. It's a trade subject to inspections, standards, and most importantly, taxes. Beer isn't just drink. It's money. Inside a tavern, a clerk in a long robe scrawls on a parchment, tallying mugs and barrels consumed. Taxes on beer are so lucrative that kings and councils see them as steady revenue streams. One quirky tidbit: in some towns, ale counters or ale tasters were appointed to check quality. These officials sometimes literally sat in beer-soaked benches to test stickiness, just as monks once did, or drink free pints in the name of public service. Not a bad gig. Unless you're lactose intolerant in a dairy town, then you're reassigned to cheese tasting, which might be worse. Historians still argue whether these taxes stifled small brewers or actually improved quality by enforcing standards. Either way, money flowed. Beer funded city walls, bridges, and armies. Every pint you drank helped fuel medieval infrastructure, whether you wanted to or not. As you wander deeper into town, you notice how beer intersects with class. Wealthy burghers drink finely brewed clear ale shells and ornate goblets, while common folk crowd around rough barrels in smoky taverns. Yet beer remains a unifier. Everyone drinks it, from apprentice blacksmiths to councilmen in fur-trimmed cloaks. The guild system ensures stability, but also creates tension. Women, once dominant in household brewing, find themselves edged out as beer becomes big business. Brewing shifts from domestic kitchens into larger, more regulated brewhouses, and slowly but surely, men and merchant guilds take control. The clatter of barrels echoes down cobblestones. Explore becomes a serious game. Cities like Hamburg and Bridges specialize in shipping hop beer across Europe, their economies swelling with trade. A brewer in London might curse when import's son undercut his local batch, while towns in Flanders or the Low Countries brag about their ferry-hacking exports. Beer is no longer just local sustenance. It's an international commodity shaping ports, trade routes, and even wars. Oddball fact: some towns enforced curfews on beer sales, worried that excessive drinking would lead to disorder. Yet taverns still spilled over with song, dice, and arguments. You sit down at one such tavern, candlelight flickering against smoke-darkened beams as a minstrel strums a lute. The beer is bitter than the stuff you had in the village, clear from hops and carefully brewed. You sip, and it tastes like the future. Sharper, cleaner, designed to last. Around you, chatter fills the room. Merchants striking deals. Apprentices complaining about guild dues. Travelers swapping gossip. Beer here isn't just a drink. It's a lubricant for urban life. It oils the machinery of trade, politics, and socializing. Historians still argue whether taverns were democratic spaces of free exchange or of hotbeds of drunken mischief. But either way, you can feel how central they are. As the night deepens, the taxman makes his rounds, scribbling numbers, making sure every drop is accounted for. You finish your mug and step outside. The town hums with lanterns swinging, guild halls echoing with debate, and ships unloading barrels onto creaking docks. In this new urban world, beer isn't just brewed. It's measured, priced, exported, and taxed. You look at the coins jangling in a merchant's purse and realize beer has become as much about money as it is about thirst. The night air cools, and you follow the clink of chains and creak of timbers down to the docks. Ships surge like slumbering beasts, the sails furled, their holds brimming with cargo. You shuffle closer and catch that unmistakable tang beer. Barrels stacked high, bound with iron hoops, ready to cross seas. The tavern chatter of trade now turns into something far riskier. Beer on the move, bound for voyages that could take weeks or even months. You step onto the deck of a creaky vessel. Sailors bustle about, tying knots and checking ropes, each one grumbling but secretly pleased at the prospect of full rations. For many centuries, beer was more than morale. It was survival. Fresh water went foul after a few days in barrels, turning brackish and slimy. Beer, with its alcohol and fermentation, lasted longer and carried fewer pathogens. You sip from a sailor's mug, flat, warm, but drinkable. In this world, that's as good as liquid gold. One mainstream fact, it's hard. The Hanseatic League, that northern European trading powerhouse, relied heavily on shipping beer across the Baltic and North Seas. Hamburg exported so much hot beer in the 14th and 15th centuries that it became practically synonymous with the product. Imagine thousands of barrels sloshing in holes, bound for distant taverns where locals toasted with foreign brew. Still, historians argue whether these long voyages truly spread beer culture or simply reinforced existing demand. Did sailors carry beer into new markets, or were they just feeding thirsty merchants already familiar with it? Either way, the image of beer rolling across waves is irresistible. Quirky tidbit: beer barrels sometimes doubled as life preservers. When storms wrecked ships, desperate sailors clung to floating casks, bobbing among the wreckage like pickles in a jar. Some even claimed that beer itself kept them alive. Liquid courage, if nothing else. You, meanwhile, rip a barrel and joke with sailor about inventing the first inflatable keg. He doesn't laugh, probably because he can't imagine a world where beer doesn't come in wood and iron. The hardships are real. Hot climates turn, beer sour faster, and barrels crack in shifting weather. Spoilage is common. Rations shrink. Morale dips. Rum eventually steals beer's place on many ships, especially in the Caribbean, where sugarcane is abundant. But in colder waters, sailors cling to their daily pint. You peer down into the galley, where barrels are wedged against salted pork and biscuits crawling with weevils. Compared to that menu, a mug of stale beer feels like ambrosia. The cook ladles out another portion, and you can't help but notice how beer binds the crew together. Songs rise as sails unfurl. Even when stomachs rumble and tempers flare, beer keeps rhythm with the sea. On deck, the captain keeps a keen eye, not just on weather, but on the beer supply. Too much drinking and discipline cracks. Too little and mutiny brews faster than the ale itself. It's a delicate balance. Beer is both reward and threat, rationed like treasure. Oddly enough, beer also sparks scientific curiosity during voyages of discovery. Some naturalists note how beer degrades, spurring interest in fermentation and preservation. These little frustrations at sea ripple into scientific breakthroughs centuries later. As the ship rocks, you hold your mug tightly, listening to the creak of wood and flap of canvas. Somewhere in the hold, barrels shift, reminder of both fortune and fragility. Beer, so central in taverns and towns, is now tested by salt, spray, and distance. The sailor beside you takes a long swallow, wipes his beard, and says, "Better than water, worse than rum." You clink mugs, acknowledging the truth of a drink that survives the sea, even if not always gracefully. The stars will overhead. The horizon swallows the last glint of land, and the ship sails on, its heartbeat measured in waves and the steady slosh of beer in its belly. You step off the creaking dock and into a bustling colonial port town. The air hums with cartwheels over cobblestones, gulls crying above, and the smells of tar with smoke and, of course, spear. A tavern sign sways in the wind painted with frothy mugs, and you duck inside, immediately enveloped by the glow of candles and the roar of conversation. Tankard thud on wooden tables. Deals are struck in low voices, and somewhere fiddler plays a tune that sounds just on the edge of falling apart. Beer in the New World isn't the luxurious stuff of European abbeys. It's practical, scrappy, and sometimes just barely beer. Colonists needed something safe to drink, and beer filled that role again, just as it did back in medieval towns. Mainstream fact here. The very first American brewery was built in 1632 in what's now New York City. Then New Amsterdam, and brewing quickly spread through other colonies. Leaders like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson even wrote down their own beer recipes. Founding fathers with frothy mugs in hand. But here's the quirky tidbit you didn't see coming. Some early colonists tried brewing with corn instead of barley, since barley was scarce. The result, a beer that was, let's politely say, an acquired taste. Imagine sipping something halfway between sweet cornbread and sour GR. Locals drink it anyway because when water makes you sick and imported beer is expensive, your options shrink fast. You take a seat in a corner of the tavern and a server slams down a tankard of dark colonial ale. Around you, heated debates rise. Rum versus beer. See, the Caribbean sugar trade flooded colonial ports with cheap rum, and beer suddenly had competition. Rum was stronger, lasted longer, and gave sailors a quicker buzz. Beer clung to its spot as the daily drink, but its dominance wobbled. Historians still argue whether beer really fueled colonial society or whether rum quietly took over. Some records show taverns selling more rum punch than beer. Others insist that colonists clung to their Alesh with stubborn loyalty. Maybe it depended on the town, the season, or how broke you were. And taverns weren't just watering holes. They were political nerve centers. You picture revolution brewing, literally, over foamy mugs as fiery speeches filled smoky rooms. Samuel Adams himself, Yes, that Sam Adams was a brewer before becoming a revolutionary. Coincidence? Probably not. Nothing stirs up talk of independence like a few rounds with friends and the comforting warmth of beer in your belly. Your eyes drift to a chalkboard menu on the tavern wall. Small beer, strong ale cider. Small beer, barely alcoholic. Thin as soup was what kids and laborers drank. Stronger a lash were for celebrations and long nights. Cider was common too, but beer held its ground. You sip from your mug and wonder how much rebellion was whispered over these drinks. How many plots were toasted in secret? A merchant nearby brags about a shipment of English beer arriving soon. Imported beer was a status symbol. Fancier, smoother, less risky than local brews. Yet, the colonies were already planting their own brewing roots, blending old-world methods with new-world improvisation. Every sip you take is a compromise between scarcity and tradition. Then comes another odd detail. Some colonial brewers flavor their beer with spruce needles when hops were hard to find. That's right, spruce beer. You take a cautious gulp, and it tastes like someone dunked your Christmas tree in molasses. Not exactly refreshing, but it did the job. And some even believed spruce beer prevented scurvy. Not bad for a holiday-flavored survival tactic. Outside the tavern, you hear the muffled ring of church bells, the shuffle of boots, the distant crack of musketries from a drill yard. Life is precarious in the colonies. Harsh winters, food shortages, political tension. But beer offers a sliver of comfort, a taste of familiarity in an unfamiliar land. As the candlelight flickers lower and tankers drain, you realize beer in the New World isn't just a drink, it's a bridge. A bridge from Europe's brewing traditions to America's growing identity. From old loyalties to revolutionary from necessity to culture. You raise your mug one last time. Foam catching a candlelight and toast silently to survival, to change, and to the pint that carried both. You shuffle into a cavernous brick warehouse. Steam hissing through iron pipes overhead. The year feels like it's shifted forward a century or two. And suddenly, the smell of beer isn't just malt and hops. It's metal, smoke, and something new. Industry brewing has left the cozy tavern and stepped into the roaring furnace of the Industrial Revolution. Here's the mainstream historical fact you need. The 18th and 19th centuries transformed beer into big business with steam engines, mechanized equipment, and improved transportation. Breweries scaled up like never before. Imagine copper kettles, the size of small houses, heated evenly by coal-fired steam rather than open flames. That meant consistent quality and more beer faster. You wander past giant vats, hearing the clank of gears, the hiss of valves, and the rhythmic pounding of machinery. Workers in rolled-up sleeves mop sweat from their foreheads, barely audible over the industrial heartbeat of the city. What once was a monk's craft has become a factory operation, and beer isn't just for locals anymore. Railroads and shipping networks carry barrels hundreds of miles away. A quirky tidbit for you. One British brewer, George Hudson, found fame by shipping a new style of strong hoppy beer to India in the early 1800s. That's the origin of the India Pale Ale. What hipsters today lovingly abbreviate as IPA. Back then, though, it wasn't a fashion statement. The extra hops preserved the beer during the months-long journey through sweltering tropical heat. You sip an early IPA and feel its bitter bite linger like a stubborn guest at the back of your throat. Historians still argue whether beer's industrial growth was good for quality. Some say mass production made it bland and predictable. sacrificing flavor for efficiency. Others argue it democratized beer, making a consistent pint available to more people than ever before. Was this the golden age of beer, or the beginning of its corporate watering down? No one fully agrees. You pause near a lab tucked inside the brewery. Yes, a lab. Science too has entered the scene. Louis Pasteur, the same guy who figured out pasteurization for milk, studied yeast in the 19th century and revealed that fermentation wasn't magic, but microbiology. Brewers could now control yeast strains, reduce spoilage, and brew with newfound precision. Suddenly, beer wasn't a gamble. It was a formula. Your boots echoed down a row of polished bottles lined neatly on a conveyor belt. Bottling itself was a revolution. Before, beer was stored in barrels, sometimes inconsistent and leaky. Now glass bottles sealed with metal caps keep beer fresher, easier to ship, easier to sell. And just as important, the rise of advertising. Posters, billboards, and newspapers shout slogans like pure, reliable, refreshing. For the first time, beer has a brand identity, and breweries compete for your loyalty. You step outside into a foggy industrial city street. Pubs glow at every corner. Neon signs promising pale ale or a porter. Working men stream and after long shifts sit still on their faces, drawn by the promise of a pint to wash down the grime of factory life. Beer becomes a social lubricant, a working-class staple, almost a daily wage in liquid form. And yet, tucked in the shadows, movements stir. Temperance advocates whisper warnings of beer as society's downfall. As factories churn out rivers of alcohol and workers stumble home glassy-eyed, reformers paint beer halls as dens of moral decay. The stage is being set for future battles, though for now, a pint flows freely. One more odd note: refrigeration. Before mechanical chillers, breweries relied on ice harvested from lakes and stored in cellars. But as the 19th century marched forward, refrigeration machines appeared, making brewing a year-round operation and especially enabling lagers to thrive. Without it, that crisp, golden lager you know today might never have left Bavaria. The warehouse clock clangs the hour, echoing above the hiss of steam. You lean against a stack of freshly bottled Alish, watching labels go on one by one, each promising familiarity in an age of change. Beer has evolved from sacred ritual to industrial commodity, yet it remains what it always was: comfort in a cup. You take a swig, the taste sharper, cleaner, colder than any colonial ale. Your throat tingles with carbonation, a modern luxury, and you can't help but grin. Industrial age or not, beer has found its way to the masses, and it's not letting go anytime soon. You step off a rattling train into a bustling American city, the air thick with the smell of cold smoke and something far more inviting: the yeasty aroma of fresh lager wafting from a corner saloon. It's the mid-1800s, and wave after wave of immigrants are reshaping the United States, not just with their labor and traditions, but with their beer. Here's the mainstream fact: German immigrants revolutionized American brewing. They brought with them lager, cold, fermented, crisp, golden, and far more refreshing than the heavier ales that had dominated earlier taverns. Brewing families like the Busch, Pabst, Schlitz, and Miller clans established breweries that would soon become household names. By the late 19th century, lager was the national drink, flooding every corner of the country. You duck into a saloon filled with clinking glasses and the sound of fiddles. Men huddle around long tables, the froth on their mugs as white as fresh snow. The lager slips down smoother than the cloudy farmhouse brews of the past. You can feel why it caught on so fast. And the technology from the previous century, steam engines, refrigeration, railroads meant that breweries could churn out massive volumes and ship them coast to coast. A quirky tidbit for you. Some German brewers actually dug massive underground beer caves beneath cities to store their lager in ice-backed coolers before modern refrigeration was widespread. In St. Louis, entire networks of tunnels once kept barrels chilled through the sweltering summer. Imagine working down there, lantern light flickering off endless rows of sweating oak casks. It must have felt like sneaking into a beer-soaked underworld. Historians still argue whether lager's domination was a blessing or a curse. Some say it introduced Americans to a clean, standardized product that felt modern and sophisticated. Others lament that the wave of pale mild lager steamrolled over older local styles, porters, stouts, and rustic ales that once thrived in small towns. Did lager elevate the beer scene or flatten it into uniformity? Depends on which historian or hipster brewer you ask. Back in the saloon, you notice how beer culture itself has shifted. Taverns aren't just places to drink. They're community centers. Immigrant families gather, music plays, political debates spark, and neighborhood life often revolves around the local beer hall. You sit at a wooden table sticky with spilled foam, watching children run between benches while their parents raise glasses. Beer is no longer just a worker's ration. It's a cultural glue. But outside the warm glow of the saloon windows, critics are sharpening their pitchforks. Temperance groups see lagers rise as a dangerous tide, threatening morality and productivity. They argue that beer, lighter than whiskey, but more widespread, is luring entire families into dependency. You hear whispers of beer barons becoming too powerful, their empire sprawling across states. The culture war over alcohol is brewing pint by pint. Here's another oddity. By the late 1800s, beer gardens became all the rage. Picture vast outdoor spaces filled with picnic tables, live music, dancing, and endless dines of lager under shady trees. They weren't just about drinking. They were wholesome outings where families mingled and kids played. Ironically, beer gardens offered a vision of drinking that was social, joyful, and not at all the depravity the temperance crowd warned about. You lean back on a wooden bench, mug in hand, as fireworks crackle overhead on a summer evening. The lager in your glass tastes crisp and bright, a far cry from the heavy medieval brews you sipped and candled at abbeys. You wonder at the speed of change, from ancient clay jugs to chilled glass steins in just a few millennia. Still, not everyone's content. Rivalries flare between immigrant brewers, between small-town ale makers and big-city lager giants, between reformers and drinkers. The seeds are being sown for something dramatic on the horizon, something that will slam the brakes on beer's golden surge. But for now, as fiddles play and mugs clink, lager reigns supreme, and America is learning to love its new national drink. You slip into a dimly lit back room where laughter is muffled behind heavy curtains and the faint clink of glasses betrays. What's really happening here? It's the 1920s, and prohibition has arrived like a hammer blow. Beer, once the lifeblood of cities and families, has been declared illegal. At least that's the official story. Out in the open, taps are dry. But here, behind a sliding panel and a whispered password, golden liquid still flows. The mainstream fact, the 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919, enforced from 1920, banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages in the United States. Breweries shuttered overnight. Thousands of workers lost their jobs, and beloved brands teetered on collapse. The prohibitionists had won their long campaign, promising healthier, more productive citizens. But in reality, Americans weren't about to give up their beer. You slide onto a bar stool in a smoky speakeasy. The barkeep smirks as he pours your frothy mug, but it's not quite the same crisp lager you remember. It's near beer, a legal, watered-down version with less than 0.5% alcohol, often doctored after the fact with whatever booze could be smuggled in. Breweries try to survive by pivoting to strange alternatives: malt syrups, ice cream, even ceramics. Imagine ordering a pint and instead getting a jug of baking syrup with a wink, knowing full well you could accidentally let it ferment at home. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some breweries secretly left instructions on their malt syrup labels saying, "Do not leave this in a cool, dark place for 2 weeks, or it will turn into beer." Wink, wink. You can picture households across the country chuckling as they accidentally brewed their own stash in bathtubs and basement. Historians still argue whether prohibition actually reduced drinking. Some studies show alcohol consumption plummeted at first. Others insist that underground brewing and bootlegging replaced lost supply almost immediately. What's clear is that people didn't stop, they just got sneakier, and sneakiness always comes with a price. Quality control went out the window. Some illegal brews were so poorly made that they caused illness, blindness, or worse. Suddenly, that dodgy pint in a basement speakeasy was more like playing Russian roulette with your liver as you sipped the foamy concoction. You hear the muffled thump of jazz from the corner. Speakeasies weren't just about drinking. They became cultural hotbeds. The music of the jazz age pulsed through hidden rooms. Gangsters ran the show, and a whole new nightlife blossomed under the cover of secrecy. You can't help but smile at the irony. By trying to stamp out alcohol, reformers had accidentally created an era of excess and rebellion. Meanwhile, the beer barons of old struggled to adapt. Anheuser-Busch tried selling soft drinks, trucks, and even baby formula. Pabst dabbled in cheese production. Yep, that's where Pabst DTT cheese came from. Others sold cereal beverages that were basically beer stripped of its punch. The industry's survival hinged on creativity, patience, and the hope that this noble experiment wouldn't last forever. But prohibition had another consequence: the rise of organized crime. Figures like Al Capone built empires on bootleg beer and liquor, raking in millions while ordinary brewers languished. You imagine kegs rolling across secret tunnels, trucks with hidden compartments, and entire police departments paid off to look the other way. Beer had become contraband, and it tasted all the sweeter for being forbidden. In your hand, the frothy mug feels heavier now. Every sip carries the weight of risk, rebellion, and resilience. And while many breweries collapsed, the ones that adapted laid the groundwork for what would come next. Because as much as authorities tried to suppress it, the human bond with beer, thousands of years deep, wasn't about to be severed by a legal decree. You lean back in your chair, the jazz swelling louder as someone kicks open the side door and a blast of cool night air rushes in. Outside, the fight between law and desire rages on. But here, in this smoky oaky candle at Speakeasy, you raise your glass in quiet defiance. Beer lives on in whispers, hidden taps and secret mugs, waiting for the day it can return to the sunlight. The smoky, speacocky air fades, And when your eyes adjust again, you're standing in a cluttered garage in the 1970s. Shelves of mason jars line the walls. A faint yeasty aroma fills the air. And someone in a flannel shirt is tinkering with a makeshift mashed tun fashioned from a picnic cooler. This, believe it or not, is where the next revolution in beer begins. Not in the marble halls of government, not in sprawling factories, but in basement and garages, where hobbyists are quietly rewriting the future. The mainstream fact: in 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed a bill legalizing home brewing again in the United States. After decades of suppression under prohibition laws, ordinary citizens could finally brew their own beer without fear of fines or jail time. That tiny flicker of freedom ignited a firestorm of creativity. What had been a dusty, stagnant industry dominated by a few massive lager producers suddenly cracked open to allow fresh flavors and wild experiments. You crouch beside a bubbling fermenter and peer inside. Instead of the pale, predictable lagers that flooded supermarkets for decades, you see golden IPAs swirling with citrus hops, inky stouts thick as midnight, and quirky brews spiked with honey, pumpkin, or chili peppers. Home brewers were no longer just making beer. They were playing with it like kids with a new chemistry set. And eventually, some of them thought, why not share it with the world? Quirky tidbit: the early craft scene had a mischievous streak. Take Anchor Brewing in San Francisco. They kept brewing small batch beer through the 1960s, surviving on a cult following. Or consider the first Great American Beer Festival in 1982. Fewer than 25 breweries participated, and one booth famously offered free pretzels just to lure tasters in. Today, that festival features thousands of beers and attracts tens of thousands of visitors. Historians still argue whether the craft movement truly started with home brewers or with stubborn regional breweries that never gave up during the corporate lager tsunami. Some credit Fritz McGagg of Anchor Brewing for kickstarting a renaissance. Others point to the thousands of backyard hobbyists whose passion created the demand. The debate lingers like the aftertaste of a strong ale, but either way, you can feel the shift. You take a sip from a bottle handed over by your flannel-clad host. It's rough, maybe even a little overcarbonated, but it's alive with personality. There's something electric about drinking a beer that doesn't taste like every other pint in the country. It's like biting into an apple and realizing you've only ever eaten apple-flavored candy before. By the 1990s, craft brewing exploded. Breweries sprouted in strip malls, warehouses, even old firehouses. Brew pubs became neighborhood staples, places where you could sit down and try a beer brewed 10 feet away from your table. And with each new release, amber Alish, porters, double IPAs, drinkers discovered that beer was more than just a cold thirst quencher. It was culture, creativity, even rebellion. You smile, remembering the dominance of light beer ads on TV, shiny cans on beaches, athletes raising frosty mugs. Craft brewers thumbed their noses at that slick uniformity. They drew dragons and skeletons on their labels, gave their beers cheeky names like Arrogant Bastard or Moose Drool, and dared drinkers to try something weird. Some worked, some flopped. But the point wasn't perfection. It was freedom. And it wasn't just America. Across the world, other nations began rediscovering their own brewing traditions. In Britain, the campaign for real ale fought to preserve Cassola. In Belgium, ancient monasteries inspired new generations of brewers. In Japan, craft pioneers experimented with local ingredients like yuzu and green tea. The movement wasn't just national, it was global. You tilt your head back, finish the last gulp from the bottle, and realize the frothy garage brew in your belly is part of something massive. From sleepy home brewers to daring entrepreneurs, the craft renaissance rewrote what beer could be. It wasn't just yellow fizz in a can anymore. It was art in a glass, and every sip carried a story of rebellion against blandness. The garage hums with excitement. You can almost see the timeline stretching forward. Festivals, collaborations, beer tourism, and endless new styles swirling out of taps like liquid imagination. And you realize this isn't just a comeback. It's a revolution foaming over the rim. The garage full of home brewers fades, and suddenly you're standing in a sleek, modern tap room, polished with counters gleaming under warm medicine bulbs. The chalkboard above the bar lists 20 beers with names that sound like indie bands. Solar Eclipse, Stout, Quantum Haze IPA, Mango Nebula Sour. You slide onto a stool and realize this is beer's present and maybe its future. The mainstream fact: beer today is one of the world's most consumed beverages, second only to water and tea. Every culture has shaped it. Belgium with its lambics, Germany with its purity lagers, Mexico with crisp cervezas, and the United States with its wildcraft explosion. At this very moment, there are over 40,000 breweries worldwide. A number of historians still debate whether humanity has ever seen before. Some argue ancient Sumer came close with local taverns on every block, but nothing compares to the sheer variety you face today. You raise a glass and swirl it. This isn't just a drink. It's liquid anthropology. A pint of Guinness tells the story of Irish resilience. A bottle of Corona hums with Mexican sunshine. A hazy New England IPA bursts with American hop obsession. Every sip carries centuries of brewing knowledge passed from monks, farmers, sailors, scientists, and now hipster brewers with ironic mustaches. Quirky tidbit: astronauts once floated the idea of brewing beer in space. In 2019, barley seeds were even sent to the International Space Station to test how microgravity affects fermentation. So, yes, cosmic beer could one day be a thing. Imagine clinking glasses on Mars with a frothy red ale brewed from Martian soil. Historians still argue whether that's science fiction or inevitable. Of course, today's beer faces challenges. Sustainability looms large. Climate change threatens barley harvests. Water shortages push breweries to recycle every drop. And hops, those delicate flavor bombs, struggle with rising temperatures. Some brewers experiment with drop-resistant grains or algae-based substitutes. Others turn to non-alcoholic craft beers, a booming trend proving you don't need the buzz to enjoy the artistry. You sip again, feeling the fizz tingle on your tongue, and think back to every place you've wandered in this journey. The Samrian tavern with cloudy brews, the Egyptian markets where workers drank rations, the Roman camps sniffing at beer, the monks' abbey cellars, the rowdy colonial taverns, the clandestine prohibition basement, and the chaotic garage brewers. It's all led here to this crowded bar buzzing with life. The person next to you orders a flight of beers, tiny glasses lined up like a painter's palette. You can't help but grin. Beer, once a survival necessity and then a cultural constant, is now a playground for human creativity. The fact that people argue whether peanut butter stout is genius or abomination just proves how far it's come. You lean back, the ambient chatter soothing as a lullaby, and imagine what's next. Aid designed beer recipes, yeast strains engineered to glow in the dark. Maybe brews personalized to your DNA, so your pint is literally made for you. Historians still argue whether beer is about tradition or innovation. But sitting here, glass in hand, you realize it's about both. The bartender sets a final pint in front of you. The glass catches the light, amber and gold swirling like liquid history. You lift it slowly, savoring the weight, the scent, the anticipation. Every bubble rising to the surface carries thousands of years of trial, error, faith, celebration, rebellion, and hope. You take that last sip, and for a moment, it feels like all of human history passes across your tongue. And now, as the taste of that final sip lingers, you let the story soften in your mind. The clamor of tap rooms, the chanting monks, the clinking of clay cups. And so, his magnificent and joyful journey from the scorching sands of Mesopotamia to today's festivals comes to an end. We've learned that beer is not just a drink, but also workers' wages, a gift from the gods, and another solid brick upon which civilization was built. This story is a legacy that carries the whisper of history in every sip. Take care of yourselves until the next journey after this enchanting adventure.